There's a particular kind of anticipation that Walking Dead fans learned to live with over the years, and it wasn't exactly pleasant. It wasn't the excitement you'd feel before a film you'd been looking forward to, or the comfort of settling in for a show that was reliably going to make you feel warm about things. It was something more like low-level dread. Sunday evenings developed a specific texture. You'd be doing something perfectly ordinary, making dinner, or half reading something, or just sitting there, and you'd remember that there was a new episode tonight, and something in you would go a little quiet, like your brain was bracing itself. Most television doesn't do that. Most television is something that happens while you're present but not really there. You watch it, it ends. Your evening continues more or less unchanged. Walking Dead, during the years it was genuinely great, colonized a specific corner of your brain and didn't leave. You'd find yourself going over something in the shower 3 days later. You'd be trying to fall asleep and end up thinking about whether a decision a character made 3 episodes ago actually tracked logically. You'd mention it to someone who didn't watch the show and find yourself unable to explain why you cared as much as you did. It was the sort of show you couldn't quite shake, which is either a feature or a flaw depending on your relationship with being haunted by fiction. That quality, the way it stayed with you, is what I want to talk about tonight. Specifically, the moments that hit hardest, the ones that got lodged somewhere and didn't quite dislodge. Not to work through them in an upsetting way, more just to look at them steadily now that there's a bit of distance. A lot of these scenes are 10, 12, 15 years old at this point. Some of them are more recent, none of them have entirely let go. We're going to move roughly in order through the show's run, starting from the early seasons when it was doing something genuinely special and working forward through the years. Some sections will be about a single episode or scene, some will be about a character arc that built over time before it ended. I'll say something about what was happening in the story, and something about why I think it worked the way it did, or why it landed the way it did even when it perhaps shouldn't have. And we'll just take our time with it. This is a long one. Get comfortable, and if you haven't already, if you could take a second to subscribe, it's completely free, and it genuinely helps the channel more than you might expect. Alright, let's start at the beginning. The Walking Dead premiered on AMC on Halloween night 2010, which, in retrospect, was very on the nose. The first scene of the first episode is Rick Grimes, played by Andrew Lincoln, walking alone through a petrol station forecourt in the Georgia heat. Passing abandoned cars, stepping over debris, no music, no narration, just the sound of wind and distant crows, and Rick's boots on tarmac. He finds a little girl in a pink bunny slipper, crouched behind a car, and he says softly, "Little girl," and she turns around. And that's where the show tells you exactly what it is. It's a quiet opening for what would become, for a period of about 4 years, the most watched drama on American cable television. Roughly 17 million people were watching it at its peak in season 4. Not 17 million people who happened to leave the telly on. 17 million people who'd made a specific appointment to sit down on Sunday nights and watch this particular show. That number, for reference, is more than the combined viewership of most cable dramas at the time. The Walking Dead wasn't just popular. It was the kind of cultural event that was becoming genuinely rare in an era of fragmented streaming and personalized content. People watched it at the same time. They talked about it on Monday. They argued about it on the internet. It was appointment television in the old sense. And what it was doing at its best was something that zombie fiction rarely bothered to do. It wasn't really interested in the walkers. The walkers were the weather. They were the permanent condition of the world, something to be managed and feared and occasionally navigated through, but not the story. The story was always about the living, and specifically about what happens to people when the structures that used to hold them, law, society, the assumption of tomorrow, simply aren't there anymore. Who do you become when there's no one watching? What do you hold on to? What do you let go of? And what happens to you when you let it go? That's a genuinely rich set of questions, and for the first 4 or 5 seasons, the show asked them with real conviction. It didn't always answer them neatly, which was part of what made it feel honest. There's a version of this show that reassures you, where the good guys hold on to their goodness, and the world eventually rewards that. And then there's the version that actually aired, which was considerably less kind about it. The pilot was directed by Frank Darabont, who'd made The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, and you can feel his hand in the pacing. There's a shot early in the episode where Rick is riding a horse through an empty Atlanta and the camera just holds on the skyline. The skyscrapers, the silence, the sheer wrongness of a city with no people in it. Nothing like that had been on television before. Nothing quite like it has been since. It had the visual grammar of a film and the patience of someone who trusted the audience to sit with a moment rather than needing to be pushed through it. That patience is actually what made the traumatic moments land as hard as they did. The show earned your investment slowly, carefully, over weeks and months of watching people try to hold it together. It gave you characters who felt real enough to grieve. It made you understand why each of them mattered to the group and to each other before it took them away. And when it did take them, and it took them often, and it took them hard, the grief had somewhere to go. The campsite massacre at the end of Season 1, Episode 4, is the first time the show demonstrates this. The group has had 2 episodes at the Atlanta camp. You know these people just enough to feel their absence. And then the camp is attacked in the middle of the night. People die suddenly and without ceremony, snatched mid-sentence, mid-motion. And then it's over, and the survivors stand in the wreckage, and you understand, properly understand, that no one in this world is safe, that the show had not been setting people up as survivors. It had been setting them up as people. Amy is the one who sticks, Andrea's younger sister, bitten in the neck, dying slowly in Andrea's arms, while everyone around them tries to keep surviving. Andrea doesn't move. She just holds her sister and she talks to her, and the camera doesn't cut away. The show lets you sit with that death in real time. Not a quick cut, not a dramatic score swell, and then on to the next scene. Just Andrea and Amy, and the particular grief of someone who knows what's coming and refuses to hurry it. I remember thinking, watching that scene for the first time, that this was a show that understood something about mourning that most shows didn't. That it takes time, and it's quiet, and it doesn't look like the movies. No notes, that's the foundation. Everything that came after was built on that specific kind of care, and the traumatic moments that people still talk about are the ones that honoured it. The show never stopped mattering for the people who'd been watching since the beginning, even when it became more uneven, because the investment was already in. The grief was already loaded. All it had to do was spend it. There's a character who appears in the very first episode of The Walking Dead and then disappears for 2.5 seasons, and when he comes back, the show uses him to say something that I think is among the most honest things it ever said about grief. His name is Morgan Jones, and the story of Morgan and his son Dwayne is, in my opinion, the most quietly devastating through line in the entire series. Not because it's given the most screen time, but because of the specific quality of what it's asking you to feel. In the pilot, Rick Grimes wakes up alone in an empty hospital and makes his way through a ruined world with no information about anything. He ends up sheltering at a house with a man named Morgan and Morgan's young son Dwayne, and Lenny James plays Morgan in that episode with a stillness and a weight that made many viewers wonder, from the very first episode, why he wasn't the main character. Morgan is clearly a thoughtful, careful person. He's been managing. He's kept his son alive. He's been gathering information. He knows the streets of the town around them and how many walkers are where. He's doing everything right. There's a scene where Rick asks Morgan what happened to his wife, and Morgan tells him. She turned. She's still in the town, a walker, and she keeps coming back to their house. She still has the instinct to return home, even now. And Dwayne, their son, who loved his mother, can't shoot her when she comes to the door. He can't do it. Every night she comes, and every night Dwayne looks at her through the scope, and his hands shake, and he lowers the gun. Morgan can't ask him to do it. He understands. So they stay there, in a house haunted by the woman who is his wife, and is no longer, and they survive, and they try. It's an extraordinary setup for a storyline the show then does essentially nothing with for 2.5 years. Morgan disappears after the pilot. Rick tries to reach him on the radio, talking into the airwaves about what he's seen and where he's going and what he knows, but there's no response. Morgan is out there somewhere, navigating the same world, carrying the same weight. When he returns in season 3, in the episode Clear, Rick finds him alone in a fortified building, completely unravelled. The walls are covered in writing, notes, fragments, warnings, a mental architecture of someone who has been alone for a very long time and has come apart in the particular way that grief and isolation combine to undo people. Morgan attacks Rick on sight. It takes time to talk him down, and then he tells Rick what happened. Dwayne is gone. His son is dead. Morgan's wife came to the door one night, and Morgan, who had been out, came home to find that Dwayne had tried to do it. Had tried to shoot his mother, and had hesitated at the last moment. The same hesitation that had protected him for months, and his mother had bitten him. Morgan had to put them both down. The writing on the walls makes sense then. Morgan had been keeping track, trying to hold the world together in the only language left to him. Clear is one of the most quietly devastating episodes of the entire series because it takes what the pilot established, Morgan's love for Dwayne, the impossible situation of the wife at the door, and shows you what happened at the end of it, years later, in the wreckage of a man who couldn't save his son. Lenny James was given one scene in that episode to let the full grief of it out, and what he does with that scene is one of the finest pieces of acting in the show's history. No qualification, Morgan eventually rejoins the group in season 5 and becomes a regular character, going through an arc about non-violence and a philosophy he adopts from a man called Eastman, who he meets in the episodes between his reappearance and his formal return to the group. The non-violence arc is complicated, and the show has mixed success with it. There are stretches where the argument is made sharply, and stretches where it becomes a mechanism to manufacture conflict with other characters. But James carries it with dignity throughout, and the specific gravity of what Morgan had been through before he rejoined never quite leaves the character. You're always watching a man who has already lost everything once, trying to figure out whether there's a version of this world where that doesn't happen again. The answer, the show suggests, is probably no. Morgan eventually leaves the main series and moves to the spin-off Fear the Walking Dead, where he continues building and losing and rebuilding, which is either thematically coherent or slightly exhausting, depending on your patience for the man. I find it coherent. I think Morgan Jones is the show's most honest portrait of someone trying to survive, not just the world, but their own history. And Lenny James brought something real to that, across a decade of playing the character. Dwayne is the first death that the show established, before the audience was watching, and I think it's the one that most purely represents what the show was doing at its best. Not the horror of death, but the specific private grief of loss that no one else can fully share with you. Morgan carried Dwayne for 11 seasons of television and never stopped carrying him, and that's the kind of story the show was capable of telling when it was paying attention. Season 2 is where the show really committed to its slower, more character-driven side, and it's also where it did the most interesting thing it ever did, with audience patience. Looking back at it now, knowing what happens, the whole first half of the season reads like a very long, very careful act of preparation. The show was building something, and it wasn't being particularly subtle about it. A little girl disappears into the woods in the first 5 minutes, and then the group spends the next 7 episodes looking for her. 7 episodes, which on a weekly schedule is almost 2 months of television. It starts simply enough. The group is stuck in a traffic jam on the highway, clearing cars when a herd of walkers moves through. everyone hides. Sophia, Carol's daughter, panics and runs into the trees. Rick goes after her, draws the walkers away, hides her in a creek bed, tells her to stay there and wait for him. And then he has to run. And when he gets back to the creek bed, she's gone. That's it. That's the setup. A child ran away. A child who'd been in the background up to this point, quiet and careful and not given much to do. And now she was just out there somewhere. What follows over the next 6 episodes is what I'd describe as the show's most sustained emotional endurance test. The search for Sophia never produces Sophia. It produces Cherokee roses left on fence posts and Daryl riding out alone on a horse because he refuses to accept she's gone. It produces Rick and Shane having one of their increasingly tense arguments about what the group should do. It produces Carl getting shot by a stray bullet at the worst possible moment, which takes the story onto the green farm and Herschel and everything that comes with that. Daryl's arc during this search is worth sitting with for a moment because it's one of the quietly brilliant things the show was doing in plain sight. Daryl Dixon at the start of the series is a problem. He's aggressive and volatile and has a brother who's actively dangerous, and he doesn't fit into any easy category of someone you root for. But across the search for Sophia, something happens to him. He goes out alone on his horse every day when everyone else has stopped believing. He finds the Cherokee rose on the hillside and brings it back to Carol and explains the old story behind it. That these flowers bloom where the tears of Cherokee mothers fell when they walked the trail of tears, and that perhaps a rose bloomed for Sophia because the angels were taking care of her. And it's this big rough man who only knows how to show care by acting, not speaking, sitting with a grieving mother and trying to give her something to hold on to. Norman Reedus didn't say much in those first 2 seasons. He didn't have to. You watched Daryl's face and you understood everything about where he came from and what this search meant to him. He'd grown up without anyone looking for him. He wasn't going to do that to someone else. That's the subtext that the show never quite stated directly, but was in every single scene. Meanwhile, the green farm is doing something else. It's giving the group an illusion of safety. This quiet pastoral setting with cattle and a warm house and Herschel's quiet authority, and slowly revealing the rot underneath it. The walkers in the barn, Herschel's belief that they were still people, Shane's mounting fury at Rick's insistence on operating according to a moral code that Shane was becoming increasingly certain was going to get everyone killed. Carol's grief, which no one quite knew how to be near. The whole farm was a pressure cooker with a very patient timer, and through all of it, Sophia was just gone. Every episode, you'd think, maybe this is the one. Maybe Daryl finds the trail that leads somewhere. Maybe one of the walkers they take down turns out not to be her. Maybe she's been hiding in a barn or a farmhouse and she's thin and scared, but alive. The show let you keep that maybe for 7 episodes. It understood that hope is not just a feeling, but a story you tell yourself, and it let you keep telling that story until the very last possible moment. The thing that made Sophia's disappearance linger was that she was a child. The show had never really given you a reason to love yet. She'd been there since the beginning, but always in the background. She was Carol's daughter, and Carol's grief was legible, but Sophia herself had been quiet, careful, a little bit invisible. And the show was gambling, correctly it turned out, that what would actually devastate people wasn't losing a beloved character. It was losing the idea of a child being out there, alone. The search wasn't really about Sophia. It was about what the group was willing to do and keep doing in service of the possibility that she might be alive. And what that cost them. Carol was the one you watched. Melissa McBride is one of the great underrated performers of that era of television. And in the season 2 first half, she was doing extraordinarily difficult work quietly. Carol had already lost everything before the apocalypse. An abusive husband, a marriage built on fear, and Sophia was the whole of her world. Watching Carol maintain herself through the search, the way she kept getting up and making herself useful, and not quite breaking, was some of the most honest grief acting I've seen. Because grief isn't usually dramatic. It's usually people keeping going because what else are you going to do? Since we're going to end up at the barn, regardless, let's just go there. Pretty Much Dead Already is the 7th episode of Season 2, the mid-season finale, and it is the episode that the Walking Dead fandom tends to refer to simply as the barn episode. If you've watched Season 2 even once, you know exactly why. It's one of those television moments that has a before and an after, the kind of scene that splits a show's history into 2 distinct eras, everything before it, and then what came after. The episode builds towards it carefully. Shane has been simmering for weeks, increasingly certain that the search for Sophia is futile, and that the group is wasting time it doesn't have. He's found out about the walkers in Herschel's barn. He's found out about Laurie's pregnancy. He's found out that Rick isn't going to stop the search, that Rick is still insisting on operating by a code of care and community that Shane has decided is a luxury the world no longer affords. By the time this episode starts, Shane is a man who has made a decision and is looking for permission, and when it doesn't come, he decides he doesn't need it. There's a sequence early in the episode where Shane argues with Rick about the search, and John Bernthal, who played Shane, is doing something very specific and very interesting there. Shane isn't wrong, and Bernthal plays it so that you feel the truth in what he's saying, even while you're uncomfortable with how he's saying it. The show had been very carefully constructing this parallel argument. Rick's way and Shane's way. Hope versus pragmatism. The world as it was and the world as it is. And Shane's position was that Sophia was dead and had probably been dead since she ran into the woods, and that the group needed to stop letting grief dictate strategy. He was right. That was the point. He was right, and it destroyed him. The actual scene at the barn happens in the afternoon sunlight, which matters. This is not a nighttime horror sequence. It happens in clear Georgia daylight, with everyone visible and no atmospheric tricks. Shane finds the guns that Dale had hidden, distributes them to the group, and walks to the barn while Rick and Herschel are still out in the fields, doing what Herschel asked. Treating the walkers like people, leading them on catch poles back toward the barn. Shane doesn't wait. He starts shooting the lock off the barn doors. The Green family watches. Maggie and Beth and Herschel's wife. Herschel's stepson. People who had been in that barn, who had gone there to mourn their dead, who had kept walkers there because some of them had been their neighbours and their family, and they hadn't been able to make themselves accept the alternative. They watch as Shane pries open the doors, and the walkers start filing out, one by one, into the sunlight, and the group shoots them, one by one, Andrea and T-Dog and Daryl and Shane. Herschel watches with an expression that is not quite rage and not quite grief. It's something older and more broken than both. Glenn doesn't join in at first. He looks at Maggie, and Maggie gives a small nod, and then he joins in. That detail matters, and the show didn't make a big deal of it. It just showed you. The walkers file out, and the group puts them down, and it goes on long enough that you start to relax slightly. You start to think, okay, this is the scene. The barn is being cleared, and then there's a pause, and then a small, hesitant figure steps out of the barn into the light. It takes a moment to register, and then you see the shoes, the blue rainbow t-shirt, and you know before Rick knows, before Carol runs forward, before anyone speaks, Sophia is wearing the shoes she had on when she ran into the woods. Carol screams her daughter's name and tries to get to her, and Daryl wraps an arm around her and holds her back. And the thing that still gets me about that moment is Daryl's face. He's the one who searched for her the longest, the hardest, the most honestly. He's the one who brought the Cherokee rose to Carol and told her about the angels. And now he's holding Carol back from what Sophia has become, and his face is utterly still. Not blank, still. The way a face goes when grief is too large for expression. Nobody raises a weapon. The whole group stands there, frozen. Even Shane, who just 5 minutes ago was in a fury of action, who'd been arguing for weeks that they needed to stop pretending. Even Shane is motionless. Because there's a version of being right that nobody actually wants. Rick is the one who steps forward. He's the last thing you expect because Rick has been arguing this whole time for the search, for hope, for the idea that Sophia was out there and that she could be brought back. And he draws his gun and he puts her down and the camera holds on Carol's face. And that's the scene. There's a note I read somewhere that the TV show Supernatural, a few seasons later, had a character mention that her deputy still had nightmares about the barn episode of The Walking Dead, which is the kind of thing that only gets written into a script when the writers know that the audience will understand it immediately. No explanation needed. The barn episode, as if there could only be one. What the show did with that moment was collapse the entire Season 2 arc into a single image. All the hope, all the searching, all of Daryl's private determination and Carol's public grief and Rick's insistence that good things were still possible, all of it resolved in the small figure of a little girl in a blue rainbow t-shirt who had been in that barn the whole time. She'd been there for weeks, maybe from the beginning, and no one had checked. The show never quite topped it, not because it didn't produce equally devastating moments. It did, and we'll get to them, but because nothing else had that specific quality of hope being turned over to reveal what was underneath it. Every other trauma in this show is about loss. This one was about what you build your hope on and what happens when the foundation was never there. Since we've been spending time in Season 2, it's worth pulling back and talking about Carol Pelletier's arc across the full run of the show, because it's one of the great slow-burn character transformations in television, and it's entirely possible to miss how extraordinary it is unless you're thinking about where she started. Season 1 Carol. Let's be honest about Season 1 Carol, because the show was honest about her in ways that weren't particularly flattering. She was a woman defined almost entirely by her relationship to the people around her, a victim of domestic violence, deferential to the point of near invisibility, seemingly incapable of acting without permission. When her husband Ed is killed in the campsite massacre, her reaction is complicated. Grief, certainly, but mixed with something the show acknowledges is relief, and then immediate guilt about the relief, and then a grief that is trying to figure out what it's actually for. She's a person the show doesn't quite know what to do with yet, and Melissa McBride plays even that early material with a specificity that makes Carol more interesting than the writing at that point has yet earned. Then Sophia disappears, and the show finds Carol, or rather, the show finds what Melissa McBride can do with Carol. The search for Sophia across the first half of Season 2 is Carol's arc as much as it is anyone's. She's the mother who has lost the one thing that was hers, and the show gives her something to do with that grief that isn't simply sad. It's active, specific, not neatly resolved. She thanks Daryl for searching with more tenderness than she's shown anyone. She maintains herself in the face of Herschel's farm and the farm's routines and the social negotiations of a group of survivors, all pretending to be more okay than they are. She gets up every day and functions. That's not a small thing. After the barn, after Sophia, something shifts. It's not that Carol becomes harder immediately. It's slower and less dramatic than that. But the woman who had been unable to act without permission begins to act. She learns to use a weapon. She becomes useful in ways that don't require anyone else's authorization. She develops a relationship with Daryl that is one of the show's most interesting, ongoing dynamics, specifically because it never resolves into anything obvious. It's not romantic, not quite parental, not quite friendship in the ordinary sense. They understand each other. That's the whole description. Two people who both grew up being overlooked, who both learned to survive by making themselves invisible, who both chose very different ways across very different timelines to become something other than what they'd been told they were. The decision she makes in Season 4, killing Karen to stop the flu from spreading through the prison, is the pivot point of the character's arc. She does it without telling anyone. She makes the calculation, she acts on it, and she accepts the consequence when Rick tells her she has to leave. She doesn't argue, she doesn't explain herself in a way that seeks absolution. She goes, and the fact that she goes, that she accepts exile rather than fighting it, tells you something about Carol that the show was developing deliberately. She had become someone who could do necessary things and then carry the weight of them alone, and she didn't need to be forgiven to keep functioning. The Grove is the culmination of that arc in Season 4, and we talked about it at length, but the arc doesn't end there. Carol keeps going, through Terminus, through Alexandria, through everything that comes after, and keeps accumulating these weights, and keeps getting back up. By the later seasons, she's the character who's paid the most, not necessarily in terms of what she's lost. Daryl and Rick and Maggie might contest that, but in terms of what she's done. The decisions she made, the things she chose so that others didn't have to. She is, in the later seasons, someone carrying an enormous amount quietly, and the show occasionally acknowledges this and occasionally forgets to, which is one of its structural problems with characters who've been there from the beginning. There's a version of The Walking Dead story where Carol is the main character. It's not the version that aired, but it's there if you look for it. The through line from the Season 1 survivor who couldn't act without permission to the Season 10 woman who blows up an entire mountain and kills the Whisperer's leader and then has to figure out who she is without a war to fight. That arc is complete, and it's coherent, and it's anchored by one of the most consistently brilliant performances in the show's entire run. Melissa McBride was not a famous actress before The Walking Dead. She'd had a small recurring role and some guest spots. The show found something in her, or she found something in the show. It's hard to say which. And what came out of it is a performance that rewards watching the show from beginning to end, specifically looking at Carol, because the transformation is gradual enough that you can miss it if you're only watching for the plot. Season 1, Carol, and Season 10. Carol looks similar on the surface. Same actress, recognizable character, but they are different people, shaped by a decade of impossible decisions, and Melissa McBride let you see every step of the distance between them. I want to talk about Shane Walsh properly, because I think he's the most underappreciated character in the entire series, and also because his arc contains a specific kind of tragedy that the show never quite managed again. Shane wasn't a villain, that's the thing. The show wants you to read him as a villain in the back half of Season 2, and on a surface level, he behaves like one. He's volatile, he's dangerous, he makes choices that are hard to defend, but he was right. He was right about nearly everything that mattered, delivered in a way that made him impossible to root for. That gap between being correct and being good is where all the most interesting tragedy in fiction lives. Shane Walsh, played by John Bernthal, starts the show in a difficult position that the show rarely gave him full credit for. When Rick woke up in the hospital, Shane had already been keeping Laurie and Carl alive for weeks. He'd gotten them out of Atlanta. He'd formed the camp, built something like a community, made himself responsible for everyone there. He'd also told Laurie that Rick was dead, which is the bit that tends to overshadow everything else, but which, in the context of an actual apocalypse, with no way to verify, with a man who'd been shot and left in a coma in an empty hospital, is at least understandable, if not forgivable. He made a decision. It turned out to be wrong. Not because he was a bad person, but because Rick survived. The show's most quietly brilliant decision about Shane was to never let him be wrong about the world. Every time Shane argued that the group needed to be harder, to make decisions based on survival rather than sentiment, to stop treating the apocalypse like a temporary inconvenience that good behavior would eventually fix, he was correct. The farm was never going to be safe forever. The search for Sophia was costing them time and resources and psychological stability for a result that never came. The walkers in Herschel's barn were a disaster waiting to happen. Shane could see all of this. He just couldn't make anyone else see it, while also being the person you wanted to listen to. His death at Rick's hands in the Season 2 finale, Better Angels, is one of the show's most precisely constructed sequences. Rick and Shane go out to the field together, ostensibly to deal with a prisoner, and you watch the moment Shane has decided what he's going to do. He's going to kill Rick, and then he's going to take over the group, and he's going to keep Laurie and Carl alive by becoming someone they can't love, but might be able to trust. It's a plan born entirely of grief, because underneath the rage and the aggression, Shane was a man who'd lost everything he'd been trying to hold on to, and the person who'd taken it from him by simply surviving was standing right there. The field scene is quiet for most of its length. Two men walking, Rick talking, trying to reach something in Shane that is already gone. And then the knife. Rick doesn't hesitate much, and the show doesn't let you process it much either. It's sudden and close, and then Shane is on the ground, and it's done. But here's what the scene adds that makes it hit differently than a standard fight scene. It gives you Rick's face after, and Rick does not look like someone who won. He looks like someone who did something that can't be undone, and knows it. Carl shooting Shane's reanimated body is the moment that breaks something permanently in the show. Carl is 12. He's been through months of this world. He's been shot. He's watched his parents' marriage fracture. He's lost Sophia and found out she was in the barn. And now he shoots his father's best friend in a field to stop him from turning. And he does it without being asked, without instruction, by his own judgment. Rick turns to look at his son, and there's a moment of pure horror on his face. Not at the act, but at what it means. Carl had already become someone who could do this, and Rick hadn't noticed, and now it was too late. What the show lost when it lost Shane was its most honest internal argument. Rick and Shane were the show's moral debate made physical. Two men who had been friends, who both loved the same people, who had completely different answers to the same question. What are you willing to become to protect the ones you love? With Shane dead, the show never really had a character who pushed back against Rick's leadership with that same quality of uncomfortable correctness. Later villains pushed back, but they were villains. Shane was a man who could have been something else in a different world. That's the specific grief of his arc. John Bernthal was offered the chance to return as the ghost version of Shane that occasionally appeared in Rick's visions. He declined, which was probably the right call. Shane worked because he was fully present, tactile, furious. A ghost version would have softened the edges. What Shane left behind was the question he raised, and the show spent the next 8 seasons living inside that question without ever quite answering it. Season 3 arrived in the autumn of 2012 with the group already changed. They'd spent the winter moving constantly, hardened by months on the road, and the people we met back in Atlanta in Season 1 were mostly still alive, but recognisably different. Rick was quieter and more deliberate. Carl had that new quality to him. Daryl had become, quietly, the most competent person in the group. They found the prison in the first episode and took it, which felt like a genuine achievement, a fortified space, cells, walls, fields, something that could be held. Killer Within is the 4th episode of Season 3. It's one of the few Walking Dead episodes that I think could genuinely be called cruel. Not in the way horror is cruel with monsters and shock, but in the specific cruelty of giving a character their best scene right before it ends them. Because Laurie Grimes was never the easiest character to be a fan of, and I think it's worth acknowledging that honestly before talking about what the show did with her death, because the two things are connected. Laurie was a divisive figure from the start, and a lot of what people disliked about her was rooted in the show's writing rather than anything Sarah Wayne Callies was doing. She was frequently placed in situations where any choice she made would be criticised, where the narrative seemed to use her as a source of complications for Rick and Shane rather than as a fully autonomous person in her own right. By Season 3, the show was aware of this, and in Killer Within, Laurie gets a single scene with Herschel that is quietly the most honest thing she says in the entire series. She tells him that she fears the baby might be born dead, and worse, that it might be born turned. She tells him that she sometimes wonders if she should have died on the farm. She makes him promise, if she doesn't survive labour. If the baby doesn't survive, do what has to be done. Don't hesitate. Herschel takes her hands and looks at her and tells her that it isn't true that Rick and Carl hate her, and that the baby will love her. And it's a quiet scene, but Sarah Wayne Callies is playing every word of it like she knows. And then the prison is breached, a trap from within, walkers flooding the cell blocks. The group is separated. Laurie goes into labour. Maggie delivers the baby in a darkened storage room, somewhere in the depths of the prison. There are no supplies, there's no time. The delivery requires a cut that will kill Laurie, and Laurie knows it, and she makes the decision herself. She talks to Carl. She tells him that being a good man is the most important thing, that it's all that matters now, that he has to carry that forward. And then she tells him she loves him, and she closes her eyes and Maggie does what she has to do. The baby lives. It's a girl. Carl shoots his mother so she doesn't turn. We hear the gunshot from outside the room, and Rick hears it too, out in the yard, already frantic, and he hears that single shot and the sound he makes when he understands what it means is the most devastating thing Andrew Lincoln ever did on this show. His legs give way. He crumbles against the fence, and the sound that comes out of him is not a scream exactly. It's something more formless than that. There are no words for what is happening in Rick's body in that moment. Lincoln played it without a word of dialogue, without any scene partner except a chain link fence, and it was one of the finest pieces of acting in the show's entire run. What followed across the next several episodes was the show doing something genuinely unusual for network television. It let Rick actually grieve. Not the standard TV version of grief, where you see a character is sad for an episode, and then they process it and get back to the plot. Rick came apart. He started receiving phone calls, actual phone calls, on a physical phone in the prison, from people who were dead. Amy, Jim, Jackie, and eventually Laurie. He talked to them. He apologised to Laurie over a crackling line for everything he hadn't said, for everything he'd let go unsaid, because there was always tomorrow and then there wasn't. He carried Judith through the prison yard, looking hollow, and then something gradually, slowly, came back. The phone calls are a strange and brave creative choice, and I've gone back and forth on them over the years. In one reading, they're a bit too overt, the show spelling out Rick's psychological state in a way it usually trusted the audience to read from Lincoln's face alone. In another reading, they're exactly right, a man who's lost the ability to tell what's real, who needs to hear that he's forgiven by people who can no longer give him that, talking into a dead phone in a boiler room. I lean toward the second reading. It's peculiar and sad, and it doesn't resolve into anything comforting. He doesn't get closure. He gets a conversation that static eventually ends. Laurie Grimes deserved better from the show than she got for most of her arc. She got it in the final 20 minutes of Killer Within, and in the grief Rick carried afterward. That's not a perfect trade, but it's something. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Governor is the show's first genuinely great villain, and the thing that makes him genuinely great is that the show is patient enough to show you how he got there. Philip Blake, played by David Morrissey, is the leader of Woodbury, a small walled town in Georgia that has managed to build something resembling civilization inside the apocalypse. Clean streets, regular meals, electricity, a community that functions. On the surface, Woodbury is everything Rick's group had been trying to build, and Philip had made it happen. Morrissey played the Governor with a specific quality that a lot of people described as charm, but I'd call it more like facility. A man who understood exactly what people needed from him in any given moment and delivered it precisely, without anything real behind it. He gave speeches, he shook hands. He was avuncular and warm and reassuring, and none of it was connected to anything. He kept his zombified daughter locked in a room and talked to her every night. He had an aquarium full of Walker heads that he watched while he sat alone and drank. He organised arena fights for entertainment and framed them as community building. He was managing everyone around him, while privately having come completely unmoored. And Morrissey made both of those things legible simultaneously, which is a genuinely difficult trick. The Season 3 storyline with the Governor and Rick's prison group is the show at something close to its most structurally satisfying. Two communities on a collision course, each with a leader who believed they were doing what had to be done, each with people inside them worth protecting. The Governor's attack on the prison at the end of Season 3 was built to be the climax, the confrontation the whole season had been moving toward, and then the show didn't quite deliver it. The assault on the prison ends in retreat. The Governor kills most of his own people in a rage when they won't follow him back in, and Rick and the group are alive but shaken, and somehow the season just ends. A lot of people found it anticlimactic. I find it interesting in retrospect because I think the show was saving something. What it was saving was the Season 4 mid-season finale. Too Far Gone aired in December 2013, and it is the episode that the Governor's entire arc was actually building toward. He returns at the head of a new group, with a tank and an ultimatum: leave the prison or he kills Herschel and Michonne, who he's taken hostage. And Rick, who has spent months trying to create a peaceful community inside those walls, who has been farming for heaven's sake, who has been asking people to put down their weapons and grow things, Rick makes a speech. He talks about what they've managed to build, about the possibility that enemies can become something else, about how he's found that enemies can become friends, neighbours. The Governor listens, and then he swings his sword. Herschel's decapitation at the prison fence is the Walking Dead moment that shocked people who thought they couldn't be shocked by this show anymore. And the reason it worked, the reason it hit as hard as it did, is about everything Scott Wilson brought to Herschel Green across 3 seasons. Herschel started the show as an obstacle, the religious farmer who didn't understand the world he was living in, who kept walkers in a barn because he thought they could be cured. But across Seasons 2 and 3, the show found something in him that became the series' moral centre. Herschel had a quality of patient faith that wasn't naive. He'd seen enough by that point to be fully aware of what the world was, but that refused to become cynicism. He believed, genuinely, that you could still be a good person, that the work of being good was still worth doing even when everything around you was designed to argue otherwise. In Too Far Gone, Herschel watches Rick's speech from where he's kneeling in the dirt, and the show gives him a moment, a quiet, private moment, where he smiles. Not because anything has been resolved, not because he thinks the speech is going to work. He smiles because Rick is still making the argument, still trying to find the version of this situation where nobody has to die. Herschel smiles because he's proud of who Rick has become, and then the Governor kills him. The scene is abrupt and brutal, and the show doesn't look away from it. And then the prison falls. All of it, everything the group had built and held and tried to make into a home, falls in the chaos that follows. The group is scattered. The walls come down. The tank drives through the garden where Rick had been growing tomatoes. And you understand, watching it, that the show had been building toward this for more than 2 years. The destruction of every place the survivors had tried to make safe. Farms, prisons, sanctuaries, none of them held, none of them could hold. That was always the point. David Morrissey was brilliant in both of his seasons, and the character was best when the show didn't over-explain him. The aquarium of heads, the way he looked at his dead daughter, those images did more work than any amount of backstory would have. I want to be upfront about something. This section is going to be about the darkest single episode The Walking Dead ever produced, and I'm going to try to talk about it in the same calm, reflective way we've been talking about everything else. But The Grove is genuinely unusual. It's one of those pieces of television that doesn't quite fit in the normal categories of difficult or upsetting or hard to watch. It sits in a different place. People who watched it when it aired in March 2014 tend to remember exactly where they were. Not because of the shock of it, but because of the grief. It's an episode that asks you to feel the specific grief of recognizing that some people, for reasons that are not their fault, cannot be saved, and that love is not always enough to change that. The setup is this. After the prison falls, the group is scattered. Among the survivors out on the road are Carol, Tyrese, baby Judith, and 2 young sisters, Lizzie, who is around 12, and Mika, who is 10. Carol had taken on a kind of surrogate parent role with these girls in the months before, and the 4 of them are now making their way toward Terminus, which the signs on the railroad tracks have been promising is a sanctuary. You know something is wrong with Lizzie fairly early in the season. She'd been showing a disturbing relationship with walkers, not frightened of them, not hardened against them, but something stranger and more troubling, fascinated by them. She names them. She's upset when they're killed. She insists with genuine conviction that the walkers are still people, still themselves, just different now, which sounds on the surface like something Herschel might have believed in season 2, except the show is careful to distinguish between Herschel's faith and Lizzie's fixation. Herschel was wrong about walkers. Lizzie is experiencing something that the language of the show doesn't quite have a word for. The 4 of them find a house in an overgrown pecan grove, a temporary shelter. The episode is slow and domestic in its pacing. Carol cooking on the wood stove, Mika learning to shoot with Carol's guidance, Tyrese sleeping off exhaustion. There's a morning with smoke in the distance from a distant fire, and you sit with the image of these 4 people in a peaceful house in a beautiful field, and, in the back of your mind, that the show is not doing this to be kind to you. It's giving you something to lose. Mika dies off screen. Carol and Tyrese return to the house from walking in the fields and find Lizzie standing in the yard, holding a bloody knife, with her little sister's body on the ground behind her. Lizzie has killed Mika to prove that she'll come back, to prove that it's okay, that you don't lose people when they turn, you just get them back differently. The scene that follows, Carol and Tyrese processing what they're looking at, talking to Lizzie, managing the immediate moment, is played with extraordinary care by Melissa McBride and Chad Coleman. There is no hysteria. There is no accusation. Lizzie is upset that they're upset. She wants them to understand. She explains, calmly and sincerely, that she was going to do the same thing to Judith. But then Carol and Tyrese came back, and she just didn't get to it yet. She thought it would be okay. She thought they'd see. Carol ties Judith to a tree so she's safe. She makes Lizzie understand that they need to go look at the flowers. She leads her into a field. The gunshot is off screen. Then there's a scene between Carol and Tyrese that is, in its own way, just as devastating as everything that preceded it. Carol puts her gun on the table between them. She tells him about Karen, the woman Tyrese had loved, who Carol had killed at the prison in season 4 to prevent the spread of a flu outbreak. She killed Karen without asking, without telling anyone. She tells Tyrese now, in this quiet room, with the gun on the table between them, and she tells him that if he needs to, she'll understand. Tyrese looks at her for a long time. He looks at the gun, and then he says he forgives her. He doesn't say it's okay, he says he forgives her, which is different. And you watch the distinction register on Carol's face. What the episode is actually about, underneath the immediate horror of what Lizzie does, is the question of what we owe people we can't save. Lizzie was not a villain. She was a child who the world had broken in a specific way, whose relationship to reality had slipped somewhere along the way, and whom neither Carol nor Tyrese could fix because the tools required didn't exist anymore. The therapy, the medication, the institutional support that a child like Lizzie might have needed, those things were gone. And so Carol made a decision, the way adults are sometimes required to make decisions about things that are genuinely unresolvable, and she carried it forward without ceremony and without self-pity. Melissa McBride is the finest actor The Walking Dead ever produced, and The Grove is the episode that proves it. The show had been building Carol's arc since season 1, from the frightened, abused wife in the background to this woman in this field making the hardest possible decision. And every step of that journey was in her face during that final scene. She'd become someone who could do this, And the terrible thing was that it had cost her every single version of herself who couldn't. I've watched The Grove twice, that's it. Both times it was a Tuesday afternoon in broad daylight. I don't think I'd watch it late at night, even now. Not because it's frightening exactly, but because grief of that specific quality deserves attention you can fully give it. After everything that happened at the prison, the show scattered its survivors across multiple storylines for the back half of season 4, and this is, for my money, some of the best television it ever made. The show was freed from its usual structures. No base camp, no community to protect, just small groups of people on roads going somewhere they hoped existed. Maggie looking for Glenn, Carol and the girls, Rick and Carl and Michonne, still processing everything. Daryl running with the Claimers for a stretch, which is a deeply strange choice that works. Beth and Daryl in the woods, bonding over nips of terrible moonshine and setting an abandoned house on fire, which remains one of the better television episodes I've seen and has essentially nothing to do with zombies. And running through all of it, the signs, the railroad tracks and the small arrows pointing toward Terminus with their promise, community for all, those who arrive survive. The signs appear throughout the back half of season 4, and they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do, giving the scattered survivors a direction, giving the audience a destination, building toward a reunion and a resolution. Terminus was going to be good. It had to be. After the prison and the Grove and everything else, the show owed its audience somewhere safe. The season 4 finale, ends with Rick and Carl and Michonne and Daryl locked in a train car at Terminus, having arrived and been immediately captured. And Rick, who had already been through enough in this season to break several ordinary people, sits in that train car and says very quietly, they're going to feel pretty stupid when they find out. They're screwing with the wrong people, which is somehow both incredibly grim and the first funny thing the show had said in months. I genuinely laughed. Completely involuntarily. The season 5 premiere, No Sanctuary, is the release of all that tension. It's the show at its most efficient and kinetic. The group escaping a slaughterhouse, Carol's extraordinary one-woman rescue operation from outside the gates, Rick's group finally having something to fight back against. Terminus was a cannibal community, it turned out. People who had been victimized themselves and had arrived at a solution that was, to put it generously, not particularly defensible. The show gives them a backstory, a few minutes of flashback showing what Terminus was before it became what it is. And it's a brief but effective complication. They weren't born monsters, they were made into them. Bob Stuckey, who is one of the more gentle presences in the back half of season 4, gets a scene in the Terminus arc that is genuinely one of the more darkly funny things the show ever attempted. The Terminus people have taken his leg and are eating it, and Bob lets them finish, and then he leans forward and tells them, and he's laughing, genuinely laughing. Tainted meat. He was bitten. He's been carrying it for days. The look on the cannibals' faces is, I won't lie, extremely satisfying. Bob is delighted about this in a way that only a man who knows he's already lost can be delighted. It's a terrible, funny, strange moment, and Chad Coleman, who also played Tyrese, played it beautifully. Carol's arc through the season 5 opener is, again, Melissa McBride doing something that most of the rest of the cast couldn't. She'd been exiled from the group by Rick in season 4 for the Karen decision, which she accepted without real argument. She was out on the road alone when Tyrese found her, still carrying Judith, and then she watched the smoke from Terminus and made a decision, and walked toward it with a sniper rifle and a zombie draped in muddy cloth as camouflage, and she blew the whole place up. By herself, while the rest of the group was still inside, and the show doesn't do a big heroic beat with it. She just does it, competently, and without ceremony, and then walks in through the back gate. Carol, at that point in the series, had become someone who didn't need to be celebrated for what she did. She just did it and moved on. The reunion between Rick and Carol, when he finds her in the chaos of the Terminus collapse and just holds on to her briefly as a thanks, is one of the show's better quiet moments. These were two people who'd been through the farm and the prison and the road separately and had both come out of it shaped in ways they hadn't planned. The hug says everything their characters wouldn't articulate out loud. Since we're talking a bit about Beth, who was off doing her own thing while all of this was happening, having been captured and taken to a hospital in Atlanta called Grady Memorial, let's talk about her. Something I haven't talked about yet, and I want to before we keep going, is the space between the traumatic moments. Because the trauma was never the whole of the show, and the reason the traumatic moments landed the way they did is largely because of what surrounded them. Walking Dead at its best was a show built on patience, on the understanding that the weight of a scene was proportional to the investment that preceded it, and that investment required quiet. There's a specific kind of scene the early Walking Dead was very good at, and it appears in scattered form throughout the first 4 or 5 seasons. 2 characters on watch at night, someone on a porch after the group is asleep, a conversation around a fire that drifts from practical to personal without anyone quite planning it, Daryl cleaning an arrow, Glenn eating something and looking at the middle distance, Rick and Carl walking with no particular destination. These scenes are, on paper, nothing. Nothing is happening. And yet they accumulate. They build a texture of life that makes you understand why you'd grieve the loss of any of these people, because you've seen them exist when nothing was required of them except being themselves. Bear McCreary composed the score for The Walking Dead across its full run, and it's one of the more quietly extraordinary pieces of work in television music history. McCreary worked primarily with acoustic instruments in the early seasons, banjo, guitar, fiddle, voices, and the music has a specifically American quality that grounds the show in its Georgia setting, even when the photography is doing something more universal. The theme itself is barely a theme. A few slow notes that feel more like a condition than a melody, like something the air has, rather than something you'd play at a piano. It doesn't tell you how to feel, it just opens a space. The quietest and most affecting scenes in the series tend to happen at roughly equal intervals between the loudest ones, and I think this was intentional in the show's structure, even when the writing was less disciplined about it. The episode Clear, which we talked about as Morgan's episode, contains a scene of Rick and Carl having breakfast in an abandoned diner while Michonne is out scavenging, and it's 4 minutes of 2 people eating and talking about small things. Carl's comics, a pair of earmuffs, Rick making sure his son eats something. It doesn't appear to be doing much, but after what comes before it and what comes after it, those 4 minutes are among the most valuable in the episode, because they remind you that these are not just characters in a plot. They're a father and a son who love each other, and you know that now in your body rather than just in your head. The show was also unusually good at showing the physical reality of the world it was depicting, not just the grotesque aspects, the walkers, the violence, but the ordinary textures of survival. Finding food, purifying water, the weight of a bag of supplies. The particular exhaustion of sleeping in a car versus a bed. The way people negotiate space in close quarters when privacy has become a luxury. These details are rarely plot relevant, but they're constantly present, and they do something important. They make the world feel inhabitable, even when it's hostile. The group isn't just surviving, they're living inside an environment that has rules and logistics and physical texture, and the show took those things seriously, even when the storylines didn't always. Daryl Dixon is the character who exists most fully in those quiet scenes. He was always better used in small moments than in large narrative arcs, and Norman Reedus understood this and played accordingly. The Daryl moments that stay with people are rarely his action sequences. They're the scene where he sits outside Carol's door when she's sick in the prison, or the Cherokee Rose on the farm, or the moment in Still where he shows Beth his hometown, and it's exactly what you'd expect, and he knows it, and the knowing costs him something. Reedus has a face that's very good at the specific expression of a person who is used to not being seen, deciding whether to be seen, and the show used that face well for years before the writing started to give Daryl less nuanced material. The conversations between characters about what they'd lost were the show at its most interesting, and they appeared most often in those quiet between the action scenes. Rick and Michonne talking about what they dream, Herschel telling Glenn that he's the luckiest man in the world just before the prison falls, Sasha and Maggie watching the sunrise on the morning before everything changes. These were the show saying, here is what we're asking you to hold. Here is what it will cost when it's gone. Pay attention now. I think the reason people find sleep videos built around Walking Dead content easy to be with is partly this quality. The show had a natural rhythm that alternated between high tension and genuine rest, and the rest parts were never empty. They were full of the specific warmth of people who'd been through things together, doing ordinary things in each other's company. That warmth is what made the cold moments cold. And at enough remove, with enough distance from the tension, what's left is mostly the warmth. The campfire conversations, the morning light over the farm, Glenn eating cereal and looking at Maggie, the ordinary texture of people who are alive and know it, and are, for a moment, grateful. Those are the moments the show earned everything else with, and they're worth sitting with. Beth Green appeared in the first episode of Season 2 and spent approximately a season and a half being very much in the background. She was Maggie's younger sister, Herschel's other daughter, a girl who'd grown up on a farm and hadn't been through anything close to what the group had been through. She was sweet, and she sang sometimes, which the show used occasionally as a way of bringing a kind of quiet gentleness to scenes that needed it. For a long time, she was the character least likely to be memorable, and I mean that in a specific, non-pejorative way. She was a person the show was clearly keeping for later. The later arrived in the back half of Season 4, when the prison fell and the show distributed its survivors across different storylines. Beth ended up with Daryl, which is not a pairing you'd have predicted, and the episode they were given together. Still, Season 4, Episode 12, is still something I think about as an example of the show at its most understatedly good. Two people stuck in a country club, going through someone else's abandoned life, getting drunk on terrible moonshine they found in a cabinet. Daryl not being able to talk about himself, Beth asking him what he did before the world ended, and Daryl not having a good answer. The two of them burning the country club down at the end because they can. It sounds like nothing on paper. On screen, it's half a season of character development compressed into 45 minutes. What still did, that the show didn't always manage, was give Beth an interior life before it asked you to grieve her. By the end of that episode, you understood something about who she was. Her stubbornness, her refusal to be left behind, the specific quality of her resilience, which wasn't toughness exactly, but something quieter and more deliberate. She'd watched her family die, her home fall, everything she'd grown up with get taken apart, and she'd come out of it still capable of being curious about the world, still interested in what Daryl was like before all this. That curiosity was the whole of her, and Daryl, who by Season 4 had become someone defined almost entirely by competence and wariness, found himself unable to pretend not to be moved by it. Maggie spent the second half of Season 4 and most of Season 5 looking for Beth without knowing what had happened to her. She'd been separated from her sister when the prison fell, and she had no information. No body, no confirmation, nothing to grieve, just absence. There's a specific quality to that kind of not knowing, and the show handled Maggie's version of it with unusual care. She kept going, she kept looking for Glenn, she kept surviving, and underneath all of it was this unresolved thing that the show kept returning to in her face when she thought no one was watching. By the time the group gets to Grady Memorial, the hospital in Atlanta where Beth has been held, working off a debt she didn't consent to under the authority of a police officer named Dawn Lerner, who has constructed a small and complicated feudal system among the survivors she's collected. Beth is not the background character from Season 2 anymore. She's been through the worst of it. She has opinions. She's been watching how Dawn runs Grady Memorial, and she's been making quiet calculations about what she's going to do about it. Emily Kinney was given real material in those episodes, and she used it. The hostage exchange should have been the resolution. The group negotiates, they get Beth and Carol, who was also there by then. They make the trade. It's tense, but it works. And then Dawn, at the last moment, adds a condition. She wants Noah, the young man who had run from Grady, returned to her. It's a power move, a small cruelty to establish that she hasn't really given anything up. And Beth, who has watched Dawn operate for weeks and understands exactly what this is, takes a small pair of scissors and drives them into Dawn's neck. Dawn shoots Beth reflexively. The bullet goes through Beth's head. Daryl shoots Dawn immediately after. The shot of Daryl carrying Beth out of the hospital, her arms hanging, her body small, while Maggie watches from across the parking lot and collapses. Maggie, who has been looking for her sister since the prison and has just gotten there, just arrived, and this is what she found, is one of the show's most purely devastating images. It's not complicated. There's no ambiguity in it. It's just loss and the specific cruelty of loss that arrives at the exact moment you'd let yourself believe you were past it. Beth's death upset people in a way that was slightly different from other Walking Dead deaths, and I've thought about why. I think it's because she was the show's quiet piece of hope, not Sophia's kind of hope, which was always fragile and which the show eventually showed was based on nothing. Beth's hope was something she'd earned. She'd been through the barn and the prison and the road, and she'd come out of it not harder exactly, but clearer. She knew what mattered. She was going to be all right. And the show killed her in the moment she acted on that clarity, the moment she decided to do something rather than wait, which gives her death a particular cruelty that the show knew it was inflicting and chose to inflict anyway. There's a small thing I find worth noting, which is that Emily Kinney went on to have a notably successful music career after leaving the show. The singing that the character did occasionally was real. Beth Green was always someone who carried music around with her, and the actual human being doing the carrying turned out to be genuinely gifted. It's a nice thing to know. There's a category of Walking Dead death that I think about separately from the major arc endings, the deaths that arrive sideways without warning, in the middle of something else. Not the Herschel moments or the Sophia moments, where the story has been building toward the loss for weeks. The ones that happen fast and random and feel genuinely accidental, because they were designed to feel that way. The show understood something true about grief, which is that it doesn't arrive on schedule. It arrives when you're in the middle of something else, and can't fully process it, and then you have to carry it forward anyway. Noah is the textbook example. He's introduced in the back half of Season 4 as a young man at Grady Memorial who wants to get out. And he's immediately a sympathetic figure. Smart, determined, just trying to survive. He escapes with Beth and then with the group. And in the Season 5 episode, Spend, Glenn takes him under his wing specifically. Glenn, who has been the show's most consistent carrier of optimism and decency since the Atlanta tank in Season 1, decides that Noah has real potential. He's going to help him, guide him, get him through this. Glenn tells Noah gently that he's going to make it. About 6 minutes later, Noah is dead. He and Glenn and Nicholas are trapped in a revolving door with walkers on both sides, and Nicholas panics and pushes out of his side, and the door spins and Noah is pulled out through the glass into the walkers outside. The shot of his face through the door, the glass, the walkers, Glenn watching and unable to do anything, is one of the most viscerally horrible moments in the show's entire run. Not because it lingers on the violence exactly, but because of what Glenn's expression does in that shot. He couldn't reach him. He was right there. He couldn't reach him. Nicholas, who caused Noah's death through cowardice, becomes a recurring problem for a while. His later death, a suicide while stranded with Glenn on top of a dumpster, is the scene that led to the infamous Glenn fake-out, which we'll get to shortly. But the point is that Noah was killed by someone else's panic in a revolving door in the middle of an episode that was already about something else. The randomness was the point. It wasn't a dramatic death, it was a stupid, contingent, avoidable death, and that's why it stayed with people. Tyrese's death in the early episodes of Season 5 is almost the opposite in terms of what it is, but it hits in a similar place. Tyrese Williams, played by Chad Coleman with the most consistently patient, gentle energy of any actor on this show, was the person who seemed least likely to die of something ordinary. He'd survived everything. He was enormous and strong and clearly capable. And then, in What Happened and What's Going On, while searching a house for supplies, a child with a turned arm bites him while he's not paying attention. The episode spends its entire length inside Tyrese's dying mind. He hallucinates. The dead come to visit him. The governor, Martin from Terminus, Bob and Beth, and the girls from the Grove, and the voice on the car radio announcing a world already full of tragedy. He argues with them. He refuses some of their versions of events. He accepts others. The governor tells him the world requires brutality, and Tyrese, even dying, disagrees. He maintains that who he chose to be mattered, even here, even at the end. The episode ends with the group surrounding Tyrese in the car as they drive, trying to keep him alive, and then the quiet cut to them digging the grave. Chad Coleman played the full dying sequence without complaint or apparent ego, which is all you can say about it. It would have been very easy for that episode to feel self-indulgent, a long hallucinatory farewell to a character who deserved better. Instead, it feels honest. The world took Tyrese in a stupid, avoidable way, and the show gave him an interior goodbye that honoured what he'd been trying to be. Bob Stuckey, who we talked about briefly in the Terminus section, is another one of these sideways deaths. He's a character with a drinking problem who'd been through multiple group failures before finding Rick's people, and the show took time with him quietly. He finds Sasha and finds something like happiness. He watches the sunrise the morning after a night that ends well and says, genuinely, that he'd forgotten what it was like to feel this good. Then the Terminus people take him. Then his leg. I won't go back through the full sequence again, but the point is that Bob's death was a slow motion kind of sideways, not sudden like Noah, not a long goodbye like Tyrese, but a series of escalating cruelties landing on a man who had just found a reason to stay. The timing was deliberate and precise and slightly merciless. The show's best deaths, if you can call them that, were the ones that respected what a character had meant while refusing to sentimentalise their ending. Real grief doesn't look like the movies. It comes when you're making dinner or standing in a parking lot, and then you have to keep going. The show understood that and deployed it, sometimes brilliantly and sometimes cruelly, and occasionally in ways that felt like both at once. The group's arrival at Alexandria is one of those moments the show uses to reveal something, not about the place, but about what the people arriving have become. It happens midway through Season 5, and the setting is exactly what it sounds like. A walled suburban community in Virginia. Nice houses, running water, a functioning political structure, children going to school, an unused swimming pool, haircuts apparently still available. Alexandria is one of the more interesting settings the show ever created because it was designed to be uncomfortable for both the group and the audience. And it manages that by being, on the surface, completely ordinary. The group, battle-hardened, stripped down to essential things, operating on instinct and threat assessment and the reflexes of people who've been surviving rather than living, arrives in Alexandria and doesn't know what to do with it. Rick doesn't trust it. Daryl physically cannot sit still inside the walls. Carol brilliantly puts on a cardigan and makes casseroles and becomes the most dangerous sleeper agent in fictional suburban history, performing safety and blandness so convincingly that the Alexandrians adopt her immediately while she maps the community's vulnerabilities and stockpiles weapons. It's genuinely funny. Carol in Season 5 is The Walking Dead being funny on purpose, which it didn't always manage. The tension Alexandria introduces is about a question the show had been asking in the background since Season 1. What do you actually want if you survive? What are you trying to get to? The answer for Rick's group, for most of the first 5 seasons, had been defined purely in terms of safety. A place to sleep without walkers getting in. Walls that held people you could trust. Alexandria offered all of those things and added something more complicated: normalcy, the expectation that you would return to something resembling the lives you'd had before. And Rick's group found that they didn't quite know how to want that anymore. That's the most interesting thing The Distance and the early Alexandria episodes do. They show you people who have been shaped by catastrophe, looking at comfort and finding it frightening. Not because they're addicted to violence, the way some critics read the group in those episodes, but because the world they'd built inside themselves was calibrated for a different environment. The skills they'd developed, the relationships they'd forged, the people they'd become. All of it was organised around surviving a world that Alexandria was asking them to pretend no longer existed. And they couldn't pretend that. They knew too much. There's a scene in Season 5 where Rick stands in a house in Alexandria and lets the taps run and looks at the water with an expression that is very hard to describe. It's not gratitude exactly. It's something more like disorientation, the specific quality of someone for whom normal things have become strange, who's been gone long enough that returning feels like arriving somewhere new. Andrew Lincoln played that scene without dialogue, just the running water in his face, and it's one of the quieter and more affecting moments of the season. The Alexandrians who were already there, Deanna Monroe, Spencer, Nicholas, the others, are interesting for what they represent rather than for who they individually are. They're people who manage to maintain the old world's categories and assumptions: status, politics, social capital, the belief that the right kind of person should be in charge. Deanna Monroe, played with quiet dignity by Tova Feldshuh, is genuinely good at politics and genuinely unprepared for the world she's been managing. She built something real at Alexandria. She just built it on foundations that couldn't hold the weight of what was coming. The fall of Alexandria, in the Season 6 mid-season finale, start to finish, is the show's most ambitious failure of that period. It set up an enormous crisis and then spread it across too many characters over too many episodes. And the resolution, when it came, was less satisfying than the premise deserved. But the image of the walls coming down, of the safe suburban streets filling with walkers from the collapsed watchtower, is still striking. Alexandria was the most sustained argument the show ever made for the possibility of rebuilding, and the show needed to break it to argue that what you build has to be built from honest foundations, not from denial. And yet, eventually, Alexandria holds. The group defends it with everything they have in No Way Out, one of the Season 6 back half's best episodes. And the community survives, damaged but intact. That's the show's answer to the question of whether normalcy is possible. Not as a return, but as something built specifically out of and through the catastrophe. Alexandria, after No Way Out, is not the Alexandria of Deanna's vision. It's something harder and stranger and more honest, populated by people who have stopped pretending that the old world is coming back, and that version of it is worth defending. Rick's speech near the end of No Way Out, which is about how Alexandria isn't the old world, it's a new one that they're going to build together, is one of the show's better articulations of its own thesis. Not the best speech in the series, but honest and earned, and said by a man who has had several seasons of evidence for the position he's taking. The group that fights for Alexandria in that episode fights for a specific idea. That building is worth it, even when it's taken from you, even when you have to start over, because the act of building is what makes people human, or keeps them human, or makes them human for the first time. That argument runs through the entire show, underneath all the trauma and the loss. It's the answer to Shane's argument, in a way. Shane said the old world's rules didn't apply, and he was right that the old world was gone. But Rick's answer, built across years of everything we've been talking about tonight, was that building new ones was the point. that caring about each other was the point, that you did it knowing it might be taken from you and you did it anyway, because what else are you going to do? What else would you even want to be? Season 6 is where the show's relationship with its audience began to shift in ways that would matter, and it's worth talking about honestly because it connects directly to everything that followed. Up to this point, the show had been trusted, even when it made choices that hurt people, killing Sophia, killing Herschel, killing Beth. There was a sense that those choices were made in service of the story, that the writers understood the weight of what they were doing and were spending it carefully. Season 6 introduced a different dynamic. It began to play games with the audience in ways that felt less like storytelling and more like management. The dumpster incident is the obvious example. In Season 6, Episode 3, Thank You, Glenn and Nicholas are surrounded by walkers on top of a dumpster, and Nicholas has a moment of genuine psychological collapse. He says, "Thank you," which is initially cryptic and then becomes clear. He shoots himself in the head, and his body falls against Glenn, and both of them go over the side into the mass of walkers below. What followed was one of the more unusual experiments in Walking Dead's history. The show simply refused to say whether Glenn was dead. For 6 full weeks, it didn't show the aftermath. It removed Stephen Yeun from the opening credits. It introduced a storyline called Here's Not Here in the very next episode that spent 45 minutes away from the question entirely, following Morgan's backstory while the audience sat in suspension. There were message boards dedicated entirely to parsing the physics of the dumpster, trying to determine from the shot whether the walkers were eating Nicholas's body or Glenn's, whether Glenn could have crawled under the dumpster, whether any of the geometry of it was survivable. 6 weeks later, Glenn crawled out from under the dumpster. He'd been under it the whole time. Now, individually, this could be defended. People survive things. The ambiguity was there in the original scene. But the audience felt it, and I think correctly felt, that they'd been manipulated. Not surprised, not genuinely uncertain, but deliberately led to a false conclusion, and then made to wait while the show wrung as much engagement and speculation out of the uncertainty as it could. The dumpster fake-out wasn't a story choice. It was a content strategy, and a significant portion of the audience identified it as such and quietly began to trust the show a bit less. That trust erosion matters for understanding what happened at the Season 6 finale, Last Day on Earth. Negan, the villain who had been looming in the background for most of the season, the man whose name the show had been dropping for episodes, finally arrives. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's entrance is extraordinary, and I mean that without any qualification. It's one of the great villain introductions in television. Negan walks out of a line of trucks in the middle of the road, carrying a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, and he speaks, and immediately the show has a different centre of gravity. Morgan plays him with a theatrical intelligence that makes him genuinely terrifying and genuinely funny at the same time, which is a very specific and very difficult register to sustain. Negan forces Rick's group to their knees in a line. He explains the new order of things, the saviors, the tribute system, the rules of engagement, and then he tells them that someone is going to die tonight, as a lesson. And he plays eeny, meeny, miny, mo with his bat, and the camera cuts to his victim's point of view, looking up at him from the ground, Lucille coming down. And then the screen goes black, and the season ends. The victim wasn't revealed until the Season 7 premiere, 6 months later in real time. There is a legitimate creative argument for the cliffhanger. Television finales are supposed to leave you wanting more. Suspense is a legitimate tool. The scene as constructed is very well made. The darkness of it, the way Negan performs the whole thing, Morgan's command of the material. I understand the reasoning, but I remember where I was watching that finale. I remember the particular quality of the fury in the room when the screen went black. And what I noticed was that the fury wasn't the excited, frustrated fury of a cliffhanger that's made you desperately want the next episode. It was something flatter, and more resentful. People felt cheated. They'd sat through a tense finale waiting for the payoff, and the show had looked them in the eye and said, "Not yet. Come back in October." After the dumpster, this felt like a pattern rather than a one-off. And when a storytelling choice starts feeling like a pattern, it means the audience has started watching the mechanism rather than watching the story, which is, for a television show, the beginning of the end. I remember discussing it with someone who said, "I don't think I trust this show to actually pay that off properly." And I defended the show because I thought it was still capable of paying things off. It turned out we were both right. The Day Will Come When You Won't Be aired on October 23rd, 2016. The title is a callback to the Season 1 finale. A doctor at the CDC named Edwin Jenner tells Rick that he's grateful for a shot at surviving the apocalypse. And Jenner replies, quietly, that the day will come when he won't be. It's a line that registered as a grim observation at the time and became a structural thesis statement 6 years later, when the show finally delivered on what the cliffhanger had been building toward. The episode was viewed by roughly 17 million people, which, if you think about it, is the show's peak audience coming back one more time. People who had been drifting away for seasons, people who had stopped watching, people who only wanted to see who died. They came back for this episode. It was the most watched episode of the series in 3 years. The episode holds the reveal for a while. It opens on Rick's face in the aftermath, broken, hollow, barely present, and Negan forces him into an RV to drive somewhere. And there's a long sequence in the fog where Negan drops Rick's hatchet on a walker-covered overpass and makes Rick go get it. It's a scene about domination, about breaking a man's sense of himself as someone who can protect the people around him, and Andrew Lincoln is extraordinary in it. Rick had been the person who held the group together by force of will for 6 seasons, and watching that being methodically taken apart is genuinely hard to watch, separate from everything else in the episode. When the flashback finally arrives, you learn it was Abraham first. Abraham Ford, Michael Kudlitz's character, the military man with the mustache and the forthright personality, and the habit of saying exactly the wrong thing in the most colourful possible terms. Abraham takes Lucille with his head up. He sits up straighter as Negan swings, and when the blows keep coming and he can barely process what's happening, his last words to Rosita are clear enough. "Suck my nuts," which is, if you think about it, exactly the right last thing for Abraham Ford to say. Defiant and absurd and entirely him. It's oddly impossibly funny given what's happening, and I think that was intentional. Abraham was a character who understood that dignity wasn't about composure. It was about not letting someone else change who you were in your final moments. Then Daryl, sitting on his knees in the dirt, watches Negan taunt Rosita with the bat, and Daryl jumps up and punches him. Everything that follows is a direct consequence of that punch. Negan says he should kill someone for that. He says he told them there would be consequences. He says, and he means it, and that's the part that is hardest to sit with, that this is not what he wanted to do. And then he walks back to the line, and the bat comes down again, and this time it's Glenn. Glenn's death is one of the most discussed scenes in the show's entire run, and I think it will remain so. The physical horror of it is documented, and not something I'm going to dwell on. What I want to talk about is what the show knew it was doing, which is, Glenn Rhee was the character who had been present since the very first episode, since the Atlanta tank, since the voice on the walkie-talkie that Rick heard in the ruined city. He had been the show's best argument for kindness as a survival strategy. Not naive kindness, not sentimental kindness, but the practical, active, genuine kindness of someone who understood that people needed each other and acted accordingly. He and Maggie had built something across 6 seasons that was the show's best portrait of love under impossible circumstances. He was going to be a father. "Maggie, I'll find you." The words come out broken after the first blows, after his skull is already... Stephen Yeun made a choice with that delivery. He made Glenn be trying. He made him reach through what was happening to her, because she was the only thing that mattered, because it was always her. And then Negan finishes it, and the group kneels in the dirt, and nobody makes a sound. The episode sparked genuine debate about whether television had a responsibility to limit certain kinds of graphic violence. News websites ran pieces about it. Viewers filed complaints. Some critics who had celebrated the show's unflinching honesty for years found themselves arguing that this was a different category of thing. The violence in that episode isn't something I'll defend on aesthetic grounds. It was extreme. It was designed to be extreme, and I think a reasonable case can be made that it pushed past the point where the extremity served the story. What I will say is that the grief underneath it was real and earned, and 6 seasons in the making. The show's ratings, which had already been declining from the season 4 peak, accelerated their decline after the season 7 premiere. Not all at once, and not because of any single thing, but something changed in the relationship between the show and its audience that night. The people who came back for the premiere left with something they hadn't expected to be asked to carry. Some of them put it down and didn't pick the show back up again. Others stayed, but differently, a little more guarded, a little less willing to lean forward. The trust that had taken 6 seasons to build was not destroyed, but it had been tested in a way that left a mark. Stephen Yeun went on to receive an Academy Award nomination for his work in Minari in 2021. I think about Glenn Rhee sometimes when I watch him in things now, not as a melancholy thing, just as a fact. The same quality of full presence that he brought to 6 seasons of a television show, the same quality of paying attention to who he was in a scene, he brings to everything he does. Glenn was always going to die on this show. That's how the story goes. But the show was lucky to have the person it had playing him. Carl Grimes' death in the mid-season finale of Season 8, How It's Gotta Be, is the Walking Dead moment that surprised people who thought they could no longer be surprised by this show. Not because of the manner of it. The bite happens quietly, off-screen, and the show takes its time before showing you what it means. But because of who it was. Carl was not supposed to die. Carl was supposed to be the point. In Robert Kirkman's original comic series, Carl Grimes is alive at the end. He's the future of the story, the child who inherits the world that the adults rebuilt, the next generation carrying forward what they managed to make. The show had been using Carl with that same quality since Season 2, since the moment he shot his father's reanimated best friend in a field, and Rick turned to look at him. Carl was walking a line between the world his parents had grown up in and the world he was actually living in, trying to integrate both, trying to figure out what kind of person it was possible to be when you had grown up learning that people were dangerous and resources were scarce and tomorrow was not guaranteed. Chandler Riggs played Carl from the age of 10 through the age of 18, which is a remarkable thing to ask of a child actor. He grew up on camera, through the farm, and the prison, and the road and Alexandria, and the character grew up with him in ways that felt genuinely honest. By Season 8, Carl was arguably the most morally coherent character on the show. He was the one still arguing, still insisting that the people on the other side of the war were people. He'd been talking to Siddiq outside the walls of Alexandria, a stranger, a possible enemy, because Siddiq's mother had believed that saving lives was what honoured the dead, and Carl found that worth believing in. He was bitten while helping Siddiq, while doing something kind. That's the specific cruelty of it. The episode doesn't reveal the bite until near the end. Carl spends most of How It's Gotta Be acting normally, helping people get out of Alexandria as the Saviours attack, making sure the community has somewhere to go, carrying on. And then in the sewers below Alexandria, he shows Rick and Michonne his side. He lifts his shirt, and the bite is there, swollen and old, something he's been carrying for a while, and has known about, and has not said anything about because there was still work to do. The scenes that follow, in honour, are the show at its most deliberate and careful. Carl had been writing letters. He'd written one for everyone who mattered. Rick, Michonne, Judith. He's been doing this quietly, across the episodes we'd already seen, and you look back and notice the signs and feel the gentle devastation of something you missed. He talks to Rick about the future he wants, the peaceful version, where Negan is part of the community rather than the enemy, where the war has ended and the building has begun. He describes it to his father with the straightforward conviction of someone who has thought about it carefully, and Rick can barely hold himself together listening. The shot that stays with me from Carl's farewell is not the goodbye to Rick, though that's extraordinary. It's the moment he's alone with Judith, his little sister, who was born while the prison was falling, who Carl protected across the worst years the show covered. He holds her and says her name, and the show doesn't give you the words of what they say to each other. It just shows you the two of them, and then it shows you Judith's face after, in someone else's arms, not quite understanding. Carl shoots himself off-screen to prevent turning. Rick and Michonne wait outside. They hear the shot. The show doesn't show you Rick's face at that moment, which is the right choice. There are some things that shouldn't be watched. The decision to kill Carl was made by AMC, and the showrunner, Scott Gimple, and Chandler Riggs and his family were unhappy about it. This is public knowledge and worth acknowledging, because when you watch Season 8 knowing that the actor was blindsided by the decision, the scenes land differently. There's a quality to Riggs' performance in those final episodes that reads now like someone working through something real, a grief that the performance and the grief behind the performance are not entirely separable from each other. What Carl's death did to the show is hard to fully assess. It removed the character who most consistently embodied the show's original thesis, that there was a future worth building, and that who you were in the building of it mattered, and left the show without anyone who could occupy that function with the same authority. Rick was always too burdened by the past. Daryl was always more comfortable with action than argument. Carl was the future tense of the story, and without him the show became a story told primarily in present and past tense. And something was missing in the construction, even when individual scenes were good. Kirkman later said that Carl's death in the television version was something he mourned for the story. Though he understood the reasons behind the choice, he was right to mourn it. Rick Grimes left the show in Season 9, Episode 5, What Comes After, and it is, despite everything the show did in the years around it, a well-made farewell to the character at its centre since the beginning. Andrew Lincoln had been part of The Walking Dead since the Atlanta hospital hallway in the pilot, and by Season 9 he'd decided it was time to leave, and the show accommodated that decision about as gracefully as a show can accommodate the departure of its lead character in the middle of its run. The circumstances are these: Rick has been holding a herd of walkers on a bridge, trying to lead them away from the communities, and an explosion becomes the only way to disperse the herd and protect the people on both sides. Rick, alone on the bridge with the walkers coming, shoots a bag of dynamite. The bridge goes up. The group watches from a distance. There's no body recovered. There's no certainty. But for all practical purposes, the story has ended, and the show continues without him. What saves the sequence is what precedes it. Rick badly injured, drifting in and out of consciousness as he rides along the bridge, hallucinates his way through the show's history. He sees Shane in the field where he died. He sees Herschel, alive and peaceful, sitting on the porch of a version of the farm that no longer exists. He sees the early camp before the massacre. He sees the people who've been gone for seasons, returning briefly to be present one more time. And the journey through those memories is the show saying goodbye to its own history, as much as to Rick. Every face a scar, every vision a reminder of what it cost to get here. Andrew Lincoln was always the best thing about the weaker seasons. Even when the writing didn't serve Rick's character well, Lincoln brought a quality of full presence that kept the character grounded. He was excellent at stillness, at the specific kind of stillness that comes from a person carrying too much, and in the bridge sequence, he uses every gram of it. The scene where Rick hallucinates Herschel, specifically, is worth seeking out on its own. Scott Wilson had died in October 2018, the night before the episode aired, and the scene with Herschel was filmed before his death and had an entirely different meaning in the context of losing him while the show was still running. It's bittersweet in multiple directions simultaneously. The helicopter takes Rick away, alive, though the show doesn't say where or under what circumstances, which was being preserved for a film that, as of this recording, is still in some state of development. The communities believe him dead, Michonne believes him dead, his children believe him dead, and then the show jumps forward 6 years, and life has continued without him, and the world has moved on with the specific quiet cruelty of worlds that move on. Since we're on the topic of Season 9, and since the season deserves some credit for doing genuinely good work in the aftermath of so much, let's talk about the Whisperers. The Whisperers are the show's most genuinely disturbing villain concept, and Alpha, played by Samantha Morton, is one of the best things the later seasons ever produced. The Whisperers are a community that has adapted to the Walker world by becoming part of it, wearing the skins of walkers, moving among them, operating on the principle that civilization was always the problem and that the strong should survive the weak. Alpha leads them with a cold, methodical conviction that has nothing theatrical about it. Where the governor performed his authority and Negan performed his violence, Alpha simply enacts hers, without decoration or commentary. The Pike scene, which closes Season 9, is the show making a statement about what the Whisperers are. Rick's communities have been building relationships with each other, moving cautiously toward a regional alliance. The Whisperers' response is to take 10 people and put their heads on pikes along the border between the communities and the Whisperers' territory. The heads include Henry, Enid, and Tara, and they're discovered by Daryl and the others as they walk the border in the dark, finding each face one by one. The shot of Daryl's face at the final pike, at the last face he finds, the one he wasn't expecting, is one of Norman Reedus's best moments in the entire series. Daryl does not have characters who cry. He has characters who go very still and very quiet, and you understand from the stillness exactly how deep it goes. The scene was shot in near darkness with minimal score, and the restraint of it gives the horror room to land. Samantha Morton brought something to Alpha that the show hadn't managed for several seasons. A villain who felt like she genuinely believed in her own worldview, not performed nihilism, not cruelty for its own sake, but a coherent and internally consistent philosophy about what the world required. She was wrong. She was demonstrably wrong in ways the show argued clearly. But she wasn't confused, and she wasn't theatrical about it. And those two things combined made her genuinely frightening in a way that no villain since the governor had quite managed. That's what the later seasons had in pockets. Moments of the original show's quality appearing in the spaces between the structural problems. The Whisperer arc is the best run of the final 3 seasons, and it's best when it's focused on Morton and on what Carol becomes across it. But that's probably its own video. Michonne Hawthorne arrives at the end of Season 2 as a silhouette carrying a katana, with 2 chained walkers behind her, and the show delivers her without explanation. No backstory, no context, just the image, a woman moving through the apocalypse with extraordinary competence, and 2 armless, jawless walkers, on leashes like the world's most disturbing pet ownership situation. It's one of the more striking character introductions in the series, and it sets up something the show takes about a season and a half to actually deliver on, which is an understanding of who this person is and why she operates the way she does. Danai Gurira played Michonne for 9 seasons, and I want to talk about what she brought to this show, because I think it's often underappreciated in discussions of The Walking Dead's best performances. Michonne is a hard character to play because she's written, particularly in the early seasons, to be deliberately opaque. She doesn't explain herself. She trusts almost nobody and makes no particular effort to change that. She's operating by a set of rules she's developed through experience, and she's not going to justify those rules to people she barely knows. This is a legitimate way for a person to be in an apocalypse, and it creates a real challenge for a performer, because opaque characters can easily become uninteresting. Guerrera never let that happen. She played every moment of Michonne's reserve as active, as a choice being made continuously by someone who understood exactly the cost of the alternative. The backstory that eventually arrives: Michonne had a son, Andre, who died in the early weeks of the apocalypse, while she and her boyfriend and his friend were being irresponsible with supplies. Distracted by their own grief over their situation, rather than attending to what their child needed, is painful precisely because of how far from her current self it places her. The woman who arrives as a silhouette with a katana was not that long before an ordinary person making ordinary mistakes. The chained walkers she kept as pets, the show eventually reveals, were her boyfriend and his friend. She kept them as a reminder of what exactly the show leaves somewhat open, of what she'd lost or of what she'd done, or of what people became when they stopped paying attention to what mattered. What Michonne brings to the show's later seasons is a version of strength that the series needed and couldn't produce from most of its other characters. Not Rick's burdened authority, or Daryl's physical competence, or Carol's earned coldness. Something more like equanimity, a quality of being settled in herself, of not needing to be approved of or understood, of acting from a clear internal code that she didn't require anyone else to ratify. It made her, eventually, the most reliable presence on the show, the character you trusted most to know what she was doing and why. Her relationship with Rick is the show's second great love story, after Glenn and Maggie, and it's distinct from Glenn and Maggie in ways that are worth noticing. Glenn and Maggie's love grew in the middle of everything, in barns and pharmacies and prison cells, catching them both in the middle of becoming the people they were going to be. Rick and Michonne's love grew out of two people who'd already been through the worst of it, who had come through the other side of grief and loss and the dismantling of their old selves, and found each other on the far side. It's quieter in its depiction, less operatic, more like something that simply became true without announcement. Danai Gurira and Andrew Lincoln had an easy, unforced chemistry in the domestic scenes. The small scenes of two people sharing a space. They both understand, and the show used that chemistry well when it wasn't busy using both characters for plot mechanics. After Rick's departure, Michonne's grief becomes the emotional centre of the show's 9th and 10th seasons. She believes him dead, raises Judith and RJ alone in Alexandria, builds walls around herself that are recognisably the early seasons Michonne accept now. They're built over something specific: the loss of Rick, the need to protect the children, the impossible task of being both parents and both leaders simultaneously. And then she leaves in season 10 because the show that Andrew Lincoln left has given her what it can give her, and because Danai Gurira had her own obligations elsewhere. And the goodbye is handled as well as the Rick goodbye was, which is to say, imperfectly, but with genuine care. There's a fan film essentially that became the culmination of both their arcs: Michonne's ship, Rick's helicopter, the eventual convergence. The films that were planned and then became a limited series are still, at time of this recording, making their way toward completion. And I don't want to spoil the shape of them here, but the promise of reunion is itself a form of grief, the grief of two people separated by circumstances and decades, carrying each other through the years between. It's an unusual way to tell that story, but it's consistent with who these characters are. People who keep going in the direction they were heading, regardless of what's in the way. What Michonne gave The Walking Dead was evidence that the show could develop characters after their origin and find something in them that hadn't been there at the start. She arrived as a mystery and became, across 9 seasons, one of the richest and most human figures the show produced. That's not a thing every series can do. The Walking Dead, at its best, could do it. Michonne is the proof. The Walking Dead was a show about loss, That's not a particularly original observation. It's obviously a show about loss, but I mean it in a specific sense. Not just the loss of people, though there was plenty of that. The loss of worlds. Every setting the show inhabited was, eventually, destroyed. The highway camp, the farm, the prison, Alexandria, the kingdom, the hilltop. The show built places for its characters to belong, and then it took them away, and the characters had to keep going. They had to carry what they'd learned and who they'd loved and keep finding reasons to build the next thing. That's what made the traumatic moments stick, I think. Not the violence of them, but the specific grief of watching people lose the world they'd made. Not just once, but over and over again, and keep choosing to make another one. Rick grieved Laurie and kept going. Carol grieved Sophia and the girls and kept going. Maggie grieved Glenn and her father and kept going and kept going and kept going. Daryl is still going, apparently. They were never people who'd resolved their grief. They were people who were carrying it and building anyway. And there is something in that, in the stubborn, irrational insistence on building things that might be taken away, that is genuinely moving. Not in an inspirational poster way, in the way that real perseverance is moving, quietly, imperfectly, and usually without anyone watching. The thing worth sitting with, years on from most of these moments, is why we're still talking about them. The original series ended in 2022 with a finale that relatively few people watched compared to its peak. The spin-offs have had varying levels of success. The discourse around the show's decline is well documented, and yet here we are, years after the barn and the prison and the bridge, still finding things to say. I think it's because the show was, for a specific window of time, genuinely great, and the things that made it great were not superficial. They were structural. They were rooted in the quality of care the show brought to its characters' interiority, to what people were thinking and feeling when the plot wasn't requiring anything of them. That kind of greatness doesn't disappear when a show declines. It stays in the episodes that had it, and those episodes remain as good as they ever were. The barn is still devastating. The Grove is still the television hour it was in 2014. Rick's breakdown after Laurie's death is still one of the finest pieces of acting in the medium. Glenn's last words to Maggie still do what they've always done, which is reach through the horror and find something purely human at the centre of it. These things don't diminish because the later seasons weren't as good, or because the franchise made commercial decisions that frustrated people. The episodes that were great remain great. The other thing that stays is the community around it. Walking Dead fandom was one of the more genuinely engaged creative communities around any piece of television. People drew fan art, wrote analysis, debated character decisions with the earnestness they'd bring to real situations involving real people. They argued about Shane for years after his death. They named their children Glenn. The investment was real, not a product of content strategy or marketing, but the natural consequence of a show that made you feel things and then left you to work out what to do with the feelings. That's a rare thing. It's rarer now than it was then, in an era where so much content is designed to be consumed and discarded rather than held. The specific moments we've talked about tonight, the barn, the Grove, the Season 7 premiere, Rick's bridge, Carl's letters, they share something that I keep coming back to. Each of them is about a person being present at the end of something. Sophia in the barn is Carol being present at the end of hope. The Grove is Carol being present at the end of what she could do for Lizzie. Glenn's death is Maggie being present at the end of everything she'd built her future around. Carl's goodbye is Rick being present at the end of the version of himself who still had his son. Rick's bridge is everyone being present at what looks like the end of Rick. And in each of those moments, the show was asking you to be present too, to not look away, to hold what was happening even when it was harder than you wanted it to be. Most entertainment lets you off the hook. It provides the feeling of depth without the depth itself, emotion without commitment. Walking Dead at those moments really did ask you to commit. to grieve genuinely for people who never existed, to let a television show matter. That's why the moments stayed. They cost something, and the things that cost us something are the things we remember. The walkers walk, the living build, and every now and then, wherever you happen to be, you find yourself thinking about Sophia in a blue rainbow t-shirt, or Glenn reaching toward Maggie, or Carl writing his letters, and the show is there again. Still with you, still costing something, still worth it. I hope this was a comfortable way to spend some time tonight. If you enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe or leave a comment. I'd genuinely love to know which moments stayed with you, or whether there are any I didn't mention that deserved a place here. There are probably a few. Take care of yourselves. Sweet dreams.